April 12, 1946, Kanagawa Prefecture, occupied Japan. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet smell of the sakura. Chiyo Tanaka, former nurse auxiliary of the Imperial Japanese Army, watched from behind the new wire fence of the Uraga internment camp. Her knuckles were white, gripping the coarse U.S. Navy-issued wool blanket. The American guard, a young Marine private first class with a face she couldn't read, shifted his M1 carbine. He wasn't watching the perimeter. He was watching his comrades, two GIs. Their olive-drab M1943 field jackets, stained with mud, were struggling to hang paper lanterns, delicate, fragile bombori, from the low-hanging cherry branches. The sight was a violation, a cognitive impossibility. "They mock us," a woman next to her hissed, her voice cracking. "They defile the blossoms." Chiyo said nothing. The dissonance was a physical ache, colder than the wind. The Kichiku Beihei, the demons who dropped the Picadon, flash boom, the brutes who machine-gunned the caves, were now preparing for hanami. This quiet act of cultural appropriation, or perhaps respect, felt more grotesque than their violence. This was not war. It was madness. This singular moment of confusion highlights the complex psychological landscape of post-war Japan. If this story resonates, consider subscribing. 8 months earlier, August 21st, 1945, a cave in southern Okinawa. August 21st, 1945, a cave in southern Okinawa. The darkness was a physical weight, tasting of limestone, iron, and the sweet copper rot of dysentery. Chiyo Tanaka held the syrette, her thumb numb on the plunger. It was the last one. She had saved it, as instructed, for this exact moment. Outside, the world had ended. The shelling, the Tetsu no Eme, the rain of steel, had finally stopped 2 days ago, replaced by the guttural, alien barks of the American Marines and the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of their flamethrowers clearing the adjacent caves. She was the last living thing in this pocket of rock, save for the flies. Her commander, Lieutenant Endo, had shot himself 3 days prior, his blood still a dark stain on the ammo crate near her feet. Her patients were all dead. Her duty was complete. All that remained was gyokusai, honorable death. She pressed the needle against the thin cotton of her gunzoku auxiliary trousers, searching for the femoral artery. A clean injection of morphine straight into the artery would be faster than the vein. She pushed the plunger. The liquid was cool as it entered her body. She lay back, her head resting on a discarded gas mask canister, and waited for the Kichiku Beihei, the demons, to pass, or for the darkness to claim her. She had failed. The darkness only thickened. It did not consume. Her body, starved and resilient, clung to life. The morphine only made her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow. Then, a new smell, gasoline and scorched earth. The barking was closer. A sharp beam of light cut the darkness, blinding her. It wasn't the red light of hell, but the yellow-white beam of a flashlight. A shadow filled the cave entrance. He was huge, helmeted, his face smeared with green and black paint. He carried the M1 rifle that had haunted her nightmares. He saw her. He shouted something. Chiyo's hand, still clutching the empty glass syrette, was raised in a final, weak gesture of defiance. The Marine lunged, his boot scattering skulls. He didn't shoot. He didn't use the bayonet. He kicked the syrette from her grasp, the glass shattering against the cave wall. He saw the red cross on her armband, hesitated, then grabbed the collar of her tunic. He dragged her out of the tomb, into the blinding, agonizing Okinawan sun. She was cargo. She was alive. And the shame was a physical burn, worse than any flamethrower. The journey from Okinawa was a blur of steel bulkheads and the constant vibrating drone of the transport ship's engines. Chiyo and 24 other women, a mix of nurses, civilian staff, and comfort women they refused to acknowledge, were herded onto a dock in Kanagawa Prefecture. The air was cool. Autumn was approaching. They were marched to the Uraga internment camp. It was not a place of chaotic violence. It was a place of lines. First, the showers. They were stripped of their filthy IJA tunics and trousers. The water was scalding, scented with harsh lye soap that stripped the skin. Then came the white rain. 2 GIs, looking impossibly bored, stood with silver canisters. They operated hand pumps, spraying a fine, chemical-smelling white powder over the women's bodies, into their hair, under their arms. DDT. Chiyo recognized the smell from medical journals. It was for lice, for typhus. The Kichiku Beihei were not beating them. They were disinfecting them, as one would disinfect cattle. The impersonal nature of the act was a new kind of violation. Dressed in stiff, new U.S. Navy-issued denim trousers and a herringbone twill shirt, clothing that smelled of mildew and sizing, she was pushed into the next line. Administration. A Nisei translator, his face a mask of indifference, asked her name, her rank, her home. Tanaka Chiyo, Gunzoku Joy, Nagasaki. The American sergeant behind the desk did not look up. He typed her answers onto a form with loud, metallic clacks, then the ink. He grabbed her hand, the hand she had used for surgery, for comfort, and rolled each finger onto an ink pad and then onto a card. The black ink staining her cuticles was the turning point. She was no longer a nurse. She was not even a prisoner. She was a set of fingerprints, an entry in a ledger. They did not seem hateful. They seemed busy. This cold, bureaucratic efficiency, this power to erase her identity with a typewriter and a splash of ink, was more terrifying than any bayonet. They handed her a metal tag and stenciled a number onto the back of her new shirt, 608J. Barrack 4, the Nisei translator said, pointing. She walked, clutching the tag. 608J. She found the wooden hut, pushed open the flimsy door, and collapsed onto an empty straw-filled mattress in the corner, invisible. In Barrack 4, time dissolved into a gray cycle of shivering, hunger, and the quiet, desperate coughing of the other women. Chiyo welcomed the weakness. She welcomed the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, supplemented only by watery daikon soup and the occasional hard biscuit that tasted of chemicals. Dysentery was moving through the barracks, and Chiyo did nothing to avoid it. She drank the unboiled water. She prayed for the fever, for the release she had been denied in the cave. To die of sickness was not honorable, but it was an ending. She had faded. She was 608J, a ghost on a straw pallet. That ended the day the commandant came. The heavy tread of his boots on the wooden floorboard silenced the room. Chiyo watched him from beneath her blanket. Captain Arthur Miller, U.S. military government. He was immaculate, his uniform pressed, his face clean-shaven. He smelled of soap and tobacco, an impossible luxury. He was not a combat soldier. He was an administrator, and his eyes scanned the squalor with the cool assessment of a factory manager inspecting faulty machinery. He was accompanied by his Nisei translator, a man whose American uniform sat awkwardly on his Japanese frame, earning him silent contempt from the prisoners. Miller stopped, consulting a clipboard. He read from a file, her file. Tanaka, Chiyo, 608J. He looked at the translator. This one, Nagasaki Nursing College, Okinawa Field Hospital, Auxiliary. Is that right? The translator knelt beside Chiyo's pallet. His voice was flat. Banlai ta, Jung Dae. You're a nurse. Get up. Chiyo stared at him, uncomprehending. Miller spoke again, his voice sharp with impatience, not malice. Tell her the dysentery cases are overwhelming the infirmary. My corpsman is one man. Sickness reduces camp stability. She is ordered to report for duty. Now. The Nisei translated. It was not a request. It was an order from the Kichiku. A cognitive impossibility. They were ordering her to save lives. They were ordering her to resume the one identity she still possessed, but in their service. The sheer pragmatic arrogance of it, that her skills belonged to them now, a camp resource to be allocated, was suffocating. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to spit. But the word nurse had struck a nerve deeper than her shame. Slowly, painfully, Chiyo Tanaka pushed herself to her feet. The infirmary was a long Quonset hut, and it was violently clean. The smell of bleach and isopropyl alcohol assaulted Chiyo, a stark contrast to the smell of death and disease in her barrack. Glass syringes boiled in a steel tray. Bandages were white, plentiful, and sterile. She wanted them to be monsters. She needed them to be. It was the only logic that held her shattered world together. A single American medic, a Navy corpsman who looked no older than 20, was working with frantic efficiency. His name tag read Harris. He was treating a woman's leg ulcer, a common affliction from malnutrition. Chiyo watched him, her eyes sharp, looking for the flaw, the sadistic gesture, the incompetence. She found none. Harris worked cleanly. He debrided the wound, dusted it liberally with a fine, yellowish-white powder from a shaker, sulfa. Chiyo recognized it, and applied a sterile dressing. His movements were economical, his touch impersonal, but not unkind. He glanced at Chiyo, his face slick with sweat. He pointed to a stack of bandages. You, cut. More, he said, miming the scissor motion. Chiyo complied, her movements stiff. She sat at a small table, the cold steel of the shears in her hand. She was a prisoner, cutting rags for the enemy. But they weren't rags. They were fine-gauge cotton. And he wasn't treating an American. He was treating a Japanese internee. The cognitive dissonance was a low hum in her skull. Then, the turning point. A mother burst in, frantic, carrying a small boy. He was limp, his eyes rolled back, his skin like dry parchment. Dysentery. Severe dehydration. Harris was still stitching the other woman's leg. He cursed under his breath, looking for a free hand, but Chiyo was already moving. The nurse, the Gunzoku auxiliary, took over before the prisoner, 608J, could stop her. She laid the child on a cot, pinched the skin on his forearm. It stayed tented, a sign of extreme fluid loss. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Harris. She spun to the medical cabinet, her trained hands searching for an IV kit, for saline, for life. Harris finished his stitch. He saw her, saw the professional assessment, the certainty in her posture. He didn't shout. He didn't stop her. He simply walked to the cabinet she was fumbling with, opened the correct drawer, and pressed a sterile infusion set into her hand. For 1 second their eyes met. It was not captor and captive. It was medic and nurse. The shared understanding was a betrayal. It humanized him. Chiyo hated him for it. From the doorway, unseen, Captain Miller watched. He nodded once, then left. Her work in the infirmary earned her a new status. She was no longer just 608J. She was Tanaka-san, the nurse. This status afforded her one privilege: a small extra portion of rice, and a place in the line when the Red Cross truck arrived with its infrequent delivery of mail. It was November. The air was brittle with cold. Chiyo stood in the queue, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her denim jacket, her breath fogging. She hadn't allowed herself to hope. Hope was a vulnerability. But her heart hammered against her ribs with a sick, frantic rhythm. Nagasaki. Had they received her letters? Were they alive? The Nisei translator called her number. 608J. He handed her a single sheet of impossibly thin, folded paper. It was not from her parents. The address was from a cousin in Hokkaido, a man she barely knew. She walked away from the line, her fingers numb as she unfolded the letter. It was censored, black ink smeared over several lines by an American administrator. But the message was clear. The cousin was brief. He had heard from a neighbor who had fled Nagasaki. He wrote of August 9th, 1945. He wrote of a new kind of bomb, a flash boom, Picadon. He listed the neighborhood, Urakami, her neighborhood. Annihilated, the kanji read, utterly destroyed. He ended with a simple, brutal sentence, Anata wa hitori desu. You are alone. Chiyo stood frozen in the wind. The world went silent. The sounds of the camp, the shouting guards, the crying children, the truck engine, faded to a distant roar. She reread the words, alone. She did not cry. Something else took root, a cold, hard realization. While she was hiding in a cave in Okinawa, failing to die, her family, her mother, her father, her younger sister, had been incinerated, vaporized by the Kichiku Beihai, by the same men who now ordered her to cut bandages and handed her this letter. The shame of her survival became an agonizing moral injury. Why her? Why was she left alive, only to serve the demons who had murdered her entire world? Her previous hatred had been abstract, an indoctrination. This was new. This was pure, personal, and cold as the November wind. She turned, walked back to Barrack 4, lay down on her straw pallet, and turned her face to the wall. For a week, Chiyo did not work. She existed. She was a body on a pallet, consuming the barest minimum of water. The corpsman, Harris, left her alone. Even Miller did not order her back. Her silent, catatonic grief was a sickness he could not manage. But her grief was infectious. The whole camp seemed to sink with her. The winter deepened. Fights broke out over slivers of soap. The quiet gammon, the endurance was cracking. This, Captain Miller could not tolerate. Disorder was a failure of administration. He called a mandatory meeting of all barrack leaders, including Chiyo, dragging her from her silence. The women huddled in the freezing mess hall, their breath pluming. Miller stood at the front, his posture rigid. Morale is unacceptable, he began, the Nisei translator echoing his sharp tones. This apathy invites disease and disorder. Chiyo stared at the floor, her mind empty. Therefore, Miller continued, I have initiated a morale program, effective in the spring. He gestured out the window toward the hills behind the camp, where the bare, black branches of cherry trees clawed at the gray sky. In April, the sakura will bloom. The military government recognizes the cultural significance of this event. We will sanction a hanami, a flower viewing festival. A confused murmur rippled through the women. Miller raised his voice. This is not optional. To facilitate this event, the camp administration will provide supplementary rations of rice, granulated sugar, and paper for lanterns. Sugar. The word hung in the air. But Chiyo heard something else. The Picadon. The flash that melted her sister. The fire that consumed her parents. The men who did this, the men who held her captive, were now offering her sugar to go look at flowers. The absurdity was so profound, so grotesque, it broke her. A sound tore from Chiyo's throat. It was not a sob. It was a laugh. A dry, hacking, terrible sound that shocked the room into silence. Miller and the translator froze. Chiyo stood up, her body shaking. The empty, grieving ghost was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp. She looked directly at Captain Miller, the commandant, the Kichiku. Bakatare. The word, idiot, fool, was clear, sharp, and laden with a contempt that needed no translation. Chiyo was not punished for her outburst. Miller, perhaps recognizing her trauma, simply ignored it. This lack of reprisal was, in itself, unsettling. It dismissed her anger as irrelevant. That night, she acted. Her grief had calcified into a hard, righteous purpose. She moved through the freezing dark of Barrack 4, a ghost whispering poison. "It is a defilement," she hissed to the older women, the ones who remembered a Japan before the war. "They murder our families with fire, and now they offer us sweets to look at flowers. It is a mockery of our ancestors. We will not go." The older women nodded, their faces grim. "You're right, Tanaka-san. It is a stain." But when Chiyo approached the pallets of the younger women, the mothers, the atmosphere changed. The whispers became arguments. "Sugar, Chiyo-san," one woman whispered back, clutching her thin blanket. "He promised sugar. My boy, he chews on wood for flavor." "It is blood money," Chiyo retorted, her voice low and fierce. "Then it is blood money we will eat." The turning point came from Etsuko, a young woman from Kobe whose child, Taro, Chiyo had treated for dysentery. Chiyo had sat with Etsuko, shared her own meager rations. She considered her an ally. "Etsuko-san," Chiyo pleaded, kneeling by her pallet. "You understand? It is our honor." Etsuko looked at her son, who was sleeping fitfully, his ribs sharp beneath his thin shirt. She looked back at Chiyo, her eyes devoid of judgment, only exhaustion. "My son has not tasted sugar in a year, Chiyo-san," Etsuko said, her voice flat. "He asks me every day why the Americans have food, and he does not. What honor is there in his hunger? They are monsters, I agree. But the sugar is real. I will go. Taro will have the sugar." Chiyo recoiled as if struck. She looked around the barrack. The older women looked away, ashamed but silent. The mothers watched her, their faces set. She was alone. Her pure hatred, her moral stand, was a luxury. It was the indulgence of someone who had nothing left to lose. These women still had children to keep alive. Her boycott had failed before it began. The morning before the hanami, she was summoned, not to the mess hall, but to the commandant's office. The room was warm. A small diesel generator powered a single light bulb and a space heater. It was an island of comfort in a sea of misery. Captain Miller sat behind a neat desk, a steaming mug of coffee at his elbow. The Nisei translator stood beside him, notebook in hand. Miller did not look angry. He looked analytical, like a biologist examining a failed specimen. "Tanaka-san," he began, the translator echoing, "your outburst was a breach of camp discipline. Your subsequent attempt to organize a boycott was an act of insubordination." Chiyo said nothing. She stared at a spot on the floor. "I have reviewed your file again," Miller continued. "I am aware of your hometown, Nagasaki." Chiyo's head snapped up. "I understand," he said, and the translator, for the first time, seemed to hesitate before speaking the words. "I understand your grief." Chiyo felt a cold rage build in her chest. He understood nothing. "However," Miller said, his tone shifting back to administrative efficiency, "this camp will maintain order. The festival is not for sentiment. It is an exercise in controlled communal activity. It is a necessary function for stability. Your personal feelings do not supersede the operational needs of this camp." He then did something that broke her composure more than any threat. He gestured to a worn black book on the corner of his desk. The gold leaf title was in English, Bushido, the Soul of Japan. "I have studied your culture," Miller said, his voice holding a note of academic pride. "The sakura blossom, the symbol of transience, of mono no aware, a beautiful, fatalistic acceptance of the impermanent. I thought it would be appropriate." The rage that filled Chiyo was pure and white-hot. He had read about her soul in a book. He, The man whose nation had unleashed an artificial sun over her home was now lecturing her on the acceptance of transience from a book. His intellectual appropriation was more violent, more obscene than the DDT, than the barbed wire, than the guns. "You read," she whispered in Japanese, knowing the translator wouldn't dare repeat the venom. "And we burned." Miller, seeing her expression but not understanding the words, took it as submission. "You are dismissed, nurse. Do not interfere with the event tomorrow." Defeated, Chiyo returned to her pallet. But sleep did not offer escape. It offered a trial. She was back in the cave in Okinawa. The air was thick again, tasting of limestone and cordite. But this time, it was not empty. Lieutenant Endo, her commander, was there. He was not dead from his own pistol. He was sitting against the ammo crate, mortally wounded, his breath a wet rattle. In the dream, she held the morphine syrette, the one she had used on herself. "It is time, Tanaka-san," he rasped, his eyes fixed on her. "Gyokusai, an honorable end." She nodded, her hands shaking. This was the justification. This was the purity she had failed to achieve. She moved to administer the dose to him, to end his suffering, but her hand would not move. "You failed," he whispered, and his voice was the voice of her father. "You lived. You brought shame. You served the Kichiku." They, she tried to explain. "They burned Nagasaki." "We all burned," the lieutenant said, his face collapsing. "Why are you still holding on to the ash?" This was wrong. This was not the memory. The dream was fracturing. I have to die," she stammered, raising the syrette to her own thigh, just as she had in reality. "No," Endo whispered. His eyes cleared. The dying soldier was gone, replaced by a man, tired and broken. He looked at her, not with contempt, but with a profound, agonizing pity. "Ikimashu," he breathed. "Live." He reached out, his bloody hand stopping hers. "Ikite, tsutairu." Live, and tell the truth. He did not condemn her for being captured. He did not condemn her for surviving. He condemned her for nothing. The shame she carried was her own. The Gyokusai code, in this final spectral moment, revealed itself not as an order, but as a release from a suffering he no longer felt. He was at peace. She was the one in hell. Chiyo awoke in the freezing dark of Barrack 4. It was hours before dawn. She lay still, the dream clinging to her. Live, and tell the truth. The truth of what? The truth of the cave? The truth of Nagasaki? Or the truth of the clumsy, book-reading captain who thought Bushido could be found on a page? She was no longer certain of her hatred. She was only terribly confused. April 12th, 1946, Kanagawa Prefecture. Drawn by a force she didn't understand, Chiyo walked toward the perimeter wire, pulling her thin wool blanket tight. The dream of the cave clung to her. Ikite tsutairu. Live and tell the truth. But what was the truth? She looked up at the hill. The sakura had exploded in a riot of pale pink, a violent, delicate affirmation of life against the gray camp, and the demons were among them. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sweet, transient smell of the blossoms. Her knuckles turned white on the blanket. A young Marine private first class, his M1 carbine slung over his shoulder, watched his comrades, not the prisoners. 2 GIs, their olive-drab M1943 field jackets dark with morning dew, were struggling. They were trying to hang paper lanterns, delicate, fragile bonbonry from the low-hanging branches. One GI, tall and red-faced, kept tearing the paper. The other, shorter, was cursing as he tried to tie a knot with gloved fingers. Chiyo had seen this moment before, in her mind's eye, as the ultimate mockery, a violation. "They defile the blossoms," a woman next to her hissed, "the Same words as before. But Chiyo was seeing it differently. The dream had shifted her focus. She watched them. They weren't performing a ritual of dominance. They weren't sneering. They were clumsy. They were cold. They looked like farm boys from a place she couldn't imagine, ordered by their academic captain to decorate for a party they didn't understand. The tall one laughed, a sharp barking sound, as another lantern ripped. Before, it had sounded like malice. Now, it sounded awkward, self-conscious. The Kichiku Beihei, the devilish brutes, were not here. In their place were just men. Clumsy, frustrated, hopelessly human men, fumbling with paper and string. The absurdity of it, the sheer pathetic clumsiness of the conquerors, broke the image. Her hatred, so pure and cold, suddenly felt heavy and ridiculous. She saw Captain Miller standing near the trunk of the largest tree, watching his men. He saw her. He turned and began walking toward the wire. He stopped a few feet from her, the barbed wire separating them. He was alone. The Nisei translator was nowhere to be seen. Miller was without his shield, without his voice. Chiyo stared at him, her body rigid, braced for the final, humiliating order. He was the commandant. She was 608J. He was the victor. She was the vanquished, the survivor of the ash. Miller looked awkward. The administrative certainty he wore in his office was gone. He fumbled in the pocket of his M1943 jacket, his leather gloves making the movement clumsy. He pulled out a small, rectangular slip of paper, a tanzaku. He held it out, not through the wire, but over it, a gesture. Chiyo did not move. It was another trick, another page from his book. "Tanaka-san," he said. Her name, in his mouth, sounded alien. He gestured with the slip. "Please." Slowly, her hand emerged from the blanket. She took the paper. It was cheap, cut from a U.S. Army memo pad, but the shape was correct. And then she saw the writing. It was not elegant kanji. It was romaji, the childish, blocky pencil strokes of someone trying to form letters in an unfamiliar language. It was the clumsy, painstaking effort of the commandant himself. She read the words, sounding them out in her mind. UKIYOTOWAHITOIKI In this fleeting world, we take a breath under the cherry blossoms. It was Isa, a famous haiku, one every child knew. It was not the poem. The poem was a cliché, something a tourist would learn. It was the effort. It was the romaji. It was the image of this cold, pragmatic, bureaucratic captain, the anthropologist who understood nothing, sitting alone in his warm office, laboriously copying letters from his Bushido book onto a scrap of paper. It was the most flawed, imperfect, clumsy, and profoundly human gesture she had ever witnessed. The act bypassed her hatred. It bypassed her indoctrination. It bypassed the Picadon and the cave and the shame. The Kichiku Beihei would never have done this. A demon would not be this awkward. Her eyes blurred. She looked from the clumsy writing to the man who wrote it, to the pink blossoms on the tree behind him. A single tear cut a clean path through the grime on Chiyo's cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of gratitude. It was a tear of release. The immense crushing weight of her required hatred, the gyokusai she had failed to perform, the shame of surviving, it all simply broke. She looked at Miller. He did not smile. He simply waited, his gloved hand still held out. A man who had exhausted his administrative and linguistic options, leaving only this clumsy gesture. She folded the tanzaku carefully. Then she did the unthinkable. She turned to the gate. "Guard!" Miller called out, his voice sharp. The young Marine with the M1 carbine tensed, moving to block her. "Open it." The Marine looked confused, but obeyed, unlatching the wire gate. Chiyo Tanaka, 608J, stepped out of the internment camp. She walked past the guard, past Captain Miller. She walked onto the hill, among the clumsy lanterns and the overwhelming beautiful trees. The other women, including Etsuko, watched her in stunned silence. She did not go to the tree Miller had designated. She found a smaller one, off by itself, its branches low and perfect. She found a strong twig and carefully, with the precision of a nurse tying a suture, tied the slip of paper to it. In this fleeting world, it was not forgiveness. Her family was still Ash. It was not friendship. He was still her captor. It was gammon, endurance. It was the recognition that the world had ended, and yet it continued. The blossoms, the clumsy GIs, the academic captain, the grieving mothers, they were all real. They were all trapped in this new, broken reality together. The truth she had to tell, the one the ghost in the cave demanded, was simply this. Life, in all its absurdity and pain, went on. A breeze moved through the branches, and a single pink petal detached itself, spiraling down. It landed on her shoulder, like a touch. Chiyo stood for a moment, took a breath, and then turned. She walked back through the gate, past Miller, and toward the Quonset hut of the infirmary. She had work to do.